Take us inside the court. When that verdict was read, what was the reaction?
Well, there was a lot of tension building up to that verdict. Everyone was on the edge of their seat. You could hear a pin drop in there. And then when the verdict was read out, it was just an avalanche of emotion. You could hear my client sobbing. I mean, I had tears welling up in my eyes, as did my co-counsel, Alexandra Hine. We could hear Mr. Zameer's family sobbing behind us. They've been living with this for the last 3 years. This has been something that's occupied their lives, and it was just a tidal wave of relief at that point.
How do they move on with their life, living in this city with the weight of all of this?
That's a challenge that they're going to face. I mean, they're good people, and Mr. Zameer, he's got a good support system, a wonderful family to support him. But I also know that he continues to feel awful. He always has throughout this process. Awful for Officer Northrup and the family of Officer Northrup. Umar has never wallowed in his own self-pity for having to deal with this. Always number one, the first thing he mentioned to me when I met him in that detention center nearly 3 years ago, it wasn't how can you get me out of here? It was, how's that man's poor family doing? Are they okay? That was the first question he asked of me, and I know he's going to live with that weight on his shoulders for the rest of his life.
There are so many things from a law perspective that we could spend hours and hours and hours discussing, and all of it would be fascinating. But there are some different approaches that you took here, including a very rare instance of giving your opening immediately after the Crown's opening, which is unusual. Why did you take that approach?
Yeah, you're right to point out that it's unusual. It's also considered a risky approach. The defense in a criminal case, because the burden's not on them, they don't have to say anything. And so the defense, for strategic reasons, is allowed to wait and hear the prosecution's full case before even deciding whether to call any evidence of their own, or rather just try to undermine the prosecution's case through cross-examination and then close to the jury and make a pitch to the jury as to why the Crown hasn't proven its case beyond reasonable doubt. In this case was unusual, though. It was unusual because we knew the story. We knew the truth, and we knew that was not going to change. No matter what evidence the prosecution presented, we knew what the truth was, and we knew what evidence that Mr. Zameer would give and what evidence Ms. Sheikh would give, because it's the same story they told police that very night when Mr. Zameer was arrested. So our narrative was not going to change no matter what the prosecution did, and so we thought it was important for the jurors, for the judge, and for Canadians to hear the truthful narrative sooner rather than later.
Just the idea of the narrative is fascinating to me because from the very beginning hours and the weeks that followed, there was a very different narrative that was being presented publicly. Cop killer, in short. And in some instances, it was coming from very high political office. The Premier, Doug Ford, saying that this was, the release of your client on bail was an example of the system prioritizing criminals, in his words, over victims. The police chief at that time, James Raymer, said that this was an intentional, deliberate act. The mayor of Brampton, where Constable Northrup lived, Patrick Brown, said the decision to release him was wrong. In the aftermath of this verdict, how do you contextualize those comments?
You can't contextualize them other than to say many of those comments were completely ignorant comments. They were reckless, they were irresponsible, and they came from people who should know better. The presumption of innocence is one of the pillars of our criminal justice system. And for politicians to spout off and sentence a man and condemn a man who's presumed innocent without knowing any of the true details of the case, it is reckless, it is irresponsible. Canadians deserve and expect more from their elected officials. I'd like to believe, I'd hope, that these politicians did not know the true facts of the case when they spouted off. Doesn't make their behavior that much better, but I'd like to give them that much benefit of doubt. The police chief arguably, he should have known. If he didn't know, he should have known what the true facts were at that point when he held a press conference saying this was a deliberate and intentional act. Because the police knew at that time what had actually happened, and they chose to ignore the truth at a time when the police had a monopoly on the public narrative. And at that time, we were receiving hate mail, even death threats, for having the audacity to take on this case. And I don't blame those folks, the ignorant folks who sent us those messages. I don't blame them, because that hatred had been stoked by elected officials and by the chief of police himself. Now, the good news story is that over the past 2 months, we've been inundated with messages of support from people across the country saying, we offer our support, we want to help, please tell us if there's a legal defense fund, we want to contribute to it. And the difference between then and now is that Canadians know the truth.
Let's talk about now, because in the aftermath of this not guilty verdict, there were a number of people who spoke outside the courthouse yesterday. You were one of them. Your client, Umar Zameer, was one of them. So was the police chief, Myron Demkew, who said that he and many officers on the Toronto Police Service had hoped for a different outcome. How do you hear those comments?
The chief of police is speaking to a particular constituency. I'd like to believe that there are many honorable police officers out there, and I'd like to believe that there are many honorable police officers who believe that the best way to honor a fallen comrade, a fallen colleague, is to tell the truth and not obfuscate or lie in order to toe that line. And indeed, there were honorable police officers who even gave testimony during the course of this trial.
The collision reconstructionist, for instance.
He's a good example of an honorable police officer. And
who said that the account of what the 3 plainclothes police officers in the garage said happened that day, by his evidence, could not have happened. But I want to pick up about what you said about the police chief's comments, that he was speaking yesterday to a particular constituency. I'm going to interpret that as police officers who are on the force right now, on his force that he is the leader of. But he's also the police chief for this city.
That's right.
What does it do for the image of the Toronto police when the police chief comes up and says, essentially, I disagree with this not guilty finding?
I think we as Canadians expect that the police service and the police chief will behave honorably. I think that's what we expect as Canadians, and we want them to. And we have a situation here where there was a lengthy trial. The evidence came out. Commentators are nearly unanimous in terms of what the appropriate outcome is. It was a jury of 12 Canadians who come from different walks of life. They heard the evidence, they deliberated carefully, and they determined that Mr. Zameer was not guilty because he's not guilty. It is somewhat frustrating and embarrassing that we have a chief of police who cannot accept this reality.
Constable Northrup's widow spoke outside the court yesterday and used a word which is a very interesting one, that she came looking for accountability. And when you lose a loved one, particularly in such sudden, tragic circumstances, he was run over, and that was never in doubt. And Umar Zameer, your client, was the one who ran him over, and that was never in doubt. But that word accountability, what can accountability look like if not a guilty verdict?
Yeah, let me just start off by saying that I have tremendous sympathy for Mrs. Northrup, and I feel horrible for what she's been through, and I sympathize with her to no end, as does my client and his family. I can't imagine right now what's going through her mind. All I can say is this. I also feel bad for her because I think she's been told a particular narrative for the last 3 years by those within the police service and perhaps the police association who were supposed to be looking out for her interests. And she's been told a particular narrative that is not true. And she's been forced to sit through the last 3 years with an impression that something happened that just didn't happen. And so she is very much a victim in all of this, and I feel horribly for her, but it would not have done anyone any good to send an innocent person to jail.
I want to speak about the context under which you see this in. You have come to some prominence as a result of this trial, but many within the legal community will already have known you. You were named one of the top 25 most influential lawyers in the country. You've been involved in a number of very high-profile cases. You began your career in New York in corporate law. You were doing pro bono work there, and you've come here and been involved in some very high-profile cases. All to say, you've had a career. Where does this fit in it? What have you learned?
Well, let me just say one thing. I appreciate that you're giving me some props here on the radio, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate the words of support from people across the country. But I want to make one thing clear. Mr. Zameer was found not guilty, not because of some fancy lawyering. I mean, we were there, we did our job, myself and my brilliant colleague, Alexandra Hine. We were there, we did our jobs. But he was found not guilty because he's not guilty, not because of any tricks or fancy lawyering his lawyers did. But in terms of where this ranks up there as one of the most fulfilling and important cases I've done. But I have many clients whose names will never be in the news, and their cases are just as important to them as this case was to Mr. Zameer. And as the defense counsel, you need to be mindful of that each and every time you step into that courtroom.
Nader Hasan, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.